My beard led the extraterrestrial beast woman to believe that I was a fertility deity. I hope you enjoy your stay in this fantastical realm. Leave a comment telling us where you are right now. Also hit that subscribe button if you like this piece. Even more brutal than the impact itself was the utter stillness that followed the shriek of metal shattering. All around Alistair was a deep and utter emptiness. He dangled precariously from the safety strap that had both saved and threatened to strangle him as he swung upside down. He felt a jarring, confusing throb as blood surged to his brain. Where the sky ought to have been outside the broken viewport, a kaleidoscope of extraterrestrial verdant and bruised purple swirled. The world has slid into a position it was never designed to be in after a cataclysmic tumble. In the cramped cockpit of the survey vessel, wanderer an odor of charred wires and ozone permeated the air. Alistair was grimly persuaded that a specific aroma reeked of doomed failure. He hung there for a long time, listening to his heart's furious double-time beat and the ship's sluggish mechanical ticking as it died. After a thorough assessment, he was happy to see no obvious signs of serious harm, beyond a slew of deep bruises that were starting to hurt like hell. He checked every joint and finger-toe, ankle, and wrist. He struggled to find the release button for his harness. The system moaned in pain before ultimately breaking away, dumping him ceremoniously into the cockpit ceiling amid a flurry of debris and broken console glass. His every muscle was in rebellion from the previous trauma, so he moved slowly and deliberately as he pushed himself up. The remainder of the spacecraft was in a state of disrepair, with the lab and crew quarters exposed to the alien atmosphere like a smashed can. Despite the stifling silence, he managed to summon his two co-workers, Captain Eva Resta and Dr. Ben Carter, by yelling their names. However, the sole response emanating from the ship's shattered hull was a muted, lamenting whistle. His worst nightmare was validated by a systematic search. Millions of kilometers beyond any hope of rescue, he stood alone as the lone survivor of a mission that had tragically ended in tragedy. Feeling sad was an unnecessary expense for him, something he needed to subdue before it could engulf him. The primary objective has shifted to ensuring one's survival. Over the course of the following few hours, he retrieved as much as he could from the debris. A chilly, pragmatic urgency drove his deeds. The main medical kit, a standard issue multi-tool, his data slate, and a little pouch of high-energy nutrition packs enough to last a few weeks with caution were all taken from his possession. His beloved flannel overshirt was also located by him, a minor but welcome refuge from the chill of the unknown provided by its thick, warm fabric. Even while it still had static, and its diagnostic light flashed an erratic yellow, the little gadget he had placed into his ear, his universal translator, appeared to have survived. With a repurposed survival knife fastened to his belt and a sturdy backpack draped over his shoulders, he stole a final glance at the wanderer's grave before abandoning it and venturing into the strange woodland. A terrifyingly uncaring universe that was also very gorgeous. Huge trees reached hundreds of feet into the sky, their roots throwing spooky, changing shadows across the forest floor, which was covered in a gentle blanket of moss that radiated a subtle interior radiance. Their leaves were a shocking shade of scarlet spreading out in elaborate geometric patterns, and their bark was black and smooth like polished obsidian. Being trained as a botanist, Alistair discovered that a portion of his brain was constantly cataloging, evaluating, and marveling at the incredible variety of life, even while his inner survival kept an eye out for danger. There was a heavy aroma of moist dirt and another thing in the air. The aroma is sweet and overwhelming, like night-blooming jasmine and overripe fruit. Creatures he couldn't see were constantly reminding him that he was an outsider in this world, with their strange musical sounds resonating through the canopy. With his senses heightened, he walked with a deliberate delicacy, his boots barely audible on the bouncy moss. He came to a little area close to a transparent stream of water. The chemical sensor in his translator had already verified its safety, so he set up a makeshift tent. He was afraid of starting a fire. No, not just yet. That is, until he discovered what may be enticed by its warmth and brightness. As dusk descended, the woodland underwent a metamorphosis, with the moss's natural glow intensifying, while strange clusters of stars sprang forth from the spaces between the scarlet leaves. An astronomical spectacle of an impossibly grandiose kind that caused his heart to hurt from a deep feeling of loneliness. With his wonderful beard, a result of the many months in space now gathering particles of alien pollen and detritus, he cautiously spent 2 days investigating the local neighborhood of his camp, mapping out resources and potential threats. After 3 days of trying to pinpoint the origin of a succession of rhythmic percussion noises, he finally came across them. Their ascent from the forest revealed him hunched over a thick, twisted path, staring into a wide, sun-dappled clearing. Their towering stature and sturdy build gave him the willies as he watched them move with an eerie, primordial elegance. The creatures stalked along their thick white fur, covering their bodies as they walked erect. They had humanoid characteristics, but were clearly not human. Their long, strong legs terminated in clawed feet, and their faces were a bizarre mix of feline and canine traits, with pointed muzzles and intelligent, expressive eyes dominating. Each of them was followed by a lengthy, hairy tail that fluttered in reaction to the forest's noises. Their spears were capped with sharp obsidian, giving them a sinister appearance. They were a hunting group. The whole group halted, their furry ears perking up, as their leader, a woman who exuded an air of even more certain authority, lifted a hand. Someone had noticed him. As a poor defense against 12 warriors who appeared capable of tearing him apart with their bare hands, Alistar's blood froze, and his hand went reflexively to the knife at his belt. The head of the group advanced her every stride, purposeful and spare. She stared at him with a terrifying intensity, her eyes a piercing bioluminescent green, and her fur a bright, nearly blazing white. While his imagination raced over a dozen medieval escape options, Alistair stayed still, his pulse pounding against his ribs. He braced himself for an onslaught, a yelled challenge, and the piercing sting of a spear. On the contrary, an exceptional event transpired. She relaxed her stiff shoulders and lowered her angry stance as she approached. Her predatory stare shifted from his eyes to his chest, and finally his face, where it became fixated on his beard. Her face was swept with an expression of complete and utter amazement, of deep and unbelieving wonder. Her low-rising sneer loosened, and her lips opened ever so slightly. A dozen feet away from him she came to a halt, her emerald eyes bright and wide, and lowered herself to the ground in a deliberate, graceful motion that belied her intimidating stature. Following their leader's lead, the other fighters imitated her movements without thinking twice. A synchronized surge of capitulation shrouded in silence. He would soon find out that she was called Nikita, and she crawled the last distance, pressing her face into his plaid shirt, with what appeared like shivering devotion, her snout burying itself in the thick hair of his visible chest at his collar. As his translator attempted to decipher the unexpected deluge of respectful language, a torrent of gibberish mixed with static came from him. Ultimately, it came together to form incoherent, nearly lyrical sentences. A seed-bearer had arrived, the first tree would be bearded and abundant, and a harbinger of life had cracked in his ear. The Alistair stood still. In this surreal scene, a group of fearsome extraterrestrial hunters adore a guy in a plaid shirt. As he tried to make sense of the unbelievable circumstances, his mind faltered. He would escape their clutches. Based on his beard and the way it sounded, they believed he was a deity, namely a fertility deity. They adored his beard. On the blazing moss, he observed the other warriors genuflecting before him, shifting his gaze from Nikita's lowered head. He realized it was a suicide attempt to try to fix their error, while he was outnumbered alone and had only a knife and his brains. He peered across the clearing toward the origin of the earlier noises when he caught sight of a fleeting motion. The outline of a vast camp encircled by dancing flames and enormous, elaborately carved totem poles could just be discerned through the foliage. The closest totem, albeit worn and visible, bore the image of a formidable, anonymous man, its most striking trait being a long, cascading beard. Someone else made the call. He placed a hand on Nikita's head gently and carefully, hoping it looked kind and godlike instead of like a scared guy who was totally out of his depth. He sighed with resignation within. As he was led into the camp, not as a captive, but as a god, the white-furred tribe's auric faces lined his way. The biggest house, built of stretched skins and braided branches, was handed to him, and he was made to endure a painfully awkward but profoundly poignant greeting ceremony, complete with a litany of ceremonial sacrifices and prayers he could not possibly comprehend. With her emerald eyes gleaming with unfaltering confidence, Nikita never left his side. On the other hand, he caught sight of an older man across the fire, his fur weathered, and his eyes filled with calculated suspicion rather than wonder. Here was Kale, the older, and Alistair beheld the initial and maybe most perilous trial of his just-discovered accidental divinity in his eyes. Alistair walked a fine and tiring tightrope in the days that followed as the parade of respect and inspection became unreal. A rising feeling of imposter syndrome let him keep up the pretense of divinity. In contrast to the primordial grace of the tribe, his plaid overshirt seemed more ridiculous. His life devolved into a succession of artfully staged personas, where he timidly accepted, offered delicacies with an air of what he believed to be divine grace, and attended tribal councils despite his limited understanding of the intricate guttural language, depending on his malfunctioning translator and Nikita's sincere, simplified explanations. He discovered that she belonged to the Cathar tribe and that their lives were closely intertwined with his entrance had disrupted the intricate spiritual rhythms that permeated the jungle. A deity who was completely ignorant of his own made-up past, he was a scam artist who lived in continual terror that his entire fragile existence may come crashing down at the slightest mistake. Being the physical embodiment of their totemic bearded symbol seemed to be his principal responsibility. More than any physical pain, the responsibility of becoming a symbol of hope for a people experiencing subtle but constant challenges weighed on him. Since the Cathar's shamans had failed to discover a way to reverse the gradual decrease in yield from their principal food source, a tuberous pathway they referred to as the crash, the advent of a fertility deity appeared to be a divine intervention sent at the perfect moment. Following Nikita to the community grain fields was both his first real challenge and his first big deceit. Her face betrayed a mix of optimism and nervousness. There was clear signs of illness among the crush plants. Their large purple leaves were drooping and spotted with brown patches, and the soil surrounding them appeared parched and barren. The trepidation and power of the tribe's farmers' faith shone through as they made despairing gestures. The botanist Alistair promptly succeeded the false god Alistair. Kneeling down, he crumbled the dirt with his fingers, acknowledging its texture and the fact that it did not retain any moisture. Not a supernatural curse, but a nutritional deficit was what he saw when he looked at the diseased leaves. Based on his extensive knowledge of xenobotany, he deduced that the soil had probably been depleted of vital minerals due to centuries of monoculture cultivation. His answer was unremarkable. It was just an earth-based agricultural idea. However, a miracle would be required in this case. He gave his first heavenly edict through Nikita and the struggling translator. Along with the crushed shells of a river creature he had seen, he told the Cathar to collect certain kinds of fallen red leaves from the forest floor, as well as a luminous moss that grew on the northern side of the obsidian-like trees. By piling the components and telling them to flip the mixture and let it cure, he instructed them to make compost. They considered it a holy rite, a concoction of divinely approved materials. It was just elementary soil science to him. When they subsequently mixed the black rich compost with the fields surrounding the accident. After only 1 week, you could see a huge difference. The plant's once vivid hues returned. As the blight started to fade, new vegetation emerged. They began to worship him more zealously, their nightly chants in his honor becoming increasingly boisterous and impassioned, because the Cathar perceived it as a miracle, the direct outcome of his divine intervention. A shadow of white fur and brilliant emerald eyes, Nikita was ever present in her capacity as his designated attendant and protector. The simple relationship between worshiper and God started to break down as a result of the constant closeness between them, giving way to something far more nuanced and individual. He was not only visible at rituals, but also during his alone moments within his domicile, when he would gaze at his data slate with a melancholy, lonely countenance, gazing at images of a world she couldn't fathom. She overheard him muttering to himself in his own tongue as he became increasingly frustrated with the translation, and seen the wonder in his eyes as he studied an unfamiliar bug or plant. And he too looked beyond the ferocious fighter, her kind demeanor toward the youngsters of the tribe, her concern flattening ears and the piercing, inquiring intellect in her gaze as she probed him about his sky world were all things he noticed. Their discussions progressed to a deeper level as his translator, enriched by their ongoing dialogue, started to perform with more precision. From her early years, he gleaned details of her first hunt and her anxieties about the fate of her people. Concepts as foreign to her as stars and ships and cities, constructed of metal and glass, seemed like the most fantastical tales. Between them, a mysterious and potent bond developed. An intimacy developed between them in the liminal area between her religion and his deceit, fostered by their common experience of isolation and the growing mutual admiration that was leading to deeper feelings of connection. The enormous gap in technology that separated them frequently provided comedic moments. As Nikita observed him getting ready for bed one night, he retrieved his multi-tool, and using its built-in water purifier, applied a layer of water collected from the stream. He quickly drank after submerging the little buzzing gadget, to a profound degree. Wide eyes widened in Nikita. It didn't matter to her if the water was dirty or not. It was absolute magic if you thought of using a little humming stone to purify it. She timidly inquired if the holy rock might also bless her water. With a serious nod, Alistair returned her water skin and proceeded to play along. She was so genuinely grateful for this small act of filtering that he felt a mix of pride and power. Once again, following an unexpected downpour, a band of young Cathar hunters had difficulty starting a fire with wet wood. As he saw their efforts fail, Alistair strolled up to his multi-tool, clicked the igniter, and in seconds, a perfect roaring flame was formed. With gaping mouths, the young warriors peered from the fire to him and back again. Then they whooped with joy and told the whole camp about the god of immediate flame. The tale of Alistair the Bountiful continues to expand. Even while these events were funny, they served as a continual reminder of the deception he was enduring, an illusion that was growing both more convenient and more perilous as time went on. Old Cale was the only one who didn't seem astonished by these wonders. In the shadows of his house, Cale observed the celebration from a place of acute skepticism, his weathered features belying his age. His belief was shattered. Instead of a deity, he beheld an odd, cunning foreigner. He chose to use words, the most powerful weapon he possessed, rather than spears, to confront the Sky Man. In the midst of a boisterous assembly gathered around the hearth, Cale stood up, his voice betraying his years and position of power, and spoke straight to Alistair. He started to ask critical questions regarding the Cathar's past, the significance of the wood spirits, and the nature of the first tree from which all life was said to have sprang, rather than questioning the wonders of the soil or the immediate flame. Allegory and cultural subtlety were woven into the questions in an effort to ensnare someone who lacked truthful understanding of their religion. As everyone in the tent bowed down, they awaited the bearded god's heavenly knowledge. Instinctively, Nikita's fingers slid toward the hilt of her knife as she braced herself to protect Alistaster's honor. An icy perspiration beaded on Alistaster's brow. He now faced the challenge he had been anticipating, a challenge that would shake his pretended divinity to its very core. Knowing that a straight response would immediately reveal him, Alistaster understood it was impossible. The only thing working for him was being an outsider and basing his decisions on what he had seen over the previous several weeks. He got up slowly, giving off the impression of deep thought that he was not actually experiencing. In his philosophical responses to Kale's inquiries, he drew on what he had learnt from Nikita about the importance of community reverence for nature and the ebb and flow of life and death. Alistaster explained to Kale in response to his question about forest spirits, the invisible bonds that unite all forms of life, from the tiniest moss to the mightiest hunter, a concept that sounded profound despite its lack of specificity. When questioned about the first tree, he didn't mention a particular one. Rather, he elaborated on the concept that all living things have a common ancestor, a seed that grew into the forest's rich variety. He took what he knew about evolution and ecology from science and wrapped it in the spiritual language he had been studying. His responses were like discoveries to many Cathar, including Nikita's deep insight that went beyond their traditional tales. Seeking a deeper comprehension of their own ideas, they did not perceive an avoidance, but rather a deity. Now that her trust in him is unwavering, Nikita's verdant eyes gleamed with a new sense of furious pride. No, Kale remained unmoved. What he heard was the deliberate, astute speech of a human, not the indisputable veracity of divine revelation. Though most people had come around to Alistaster Kale's expression, suggested that the fight was far from finished. Several other warriors and elders exchanged knowing, worried looks as the elders took their seats. Alistaster found himself at the epicenter of a widening rift as the first fissures in the tribe's oneness began to show. An unholy deity who had become the Cathar people's most polarizing figure by complete accident. Less than 30 days following his remarkable success with the crush fields, Alistaster's delicate serenity, which he had mediated with his meager botanical expertise, was broken. From the outskirts of the forest, a new disease started to spread, something far more sinister and scary than a lack of a single vitamin. The change began softly, with the once vivid red leaves of the large trees drooping and curling at the edges until turning a sickening necrotic black. As the moss's soft light faded into a spotty brown, casting the nights into a darker, more foreboding shadow, the woodland floor became less luminous. It wasn't just plants that were affected by the blight, as the Cathar started to mumble in terror. The smaller woodland animals, which were before plentiful, were uncommon, and the hunters who did come upon them sometimes found them severely undernourished and unusually unmotivated. They move slowly and have spotty fur. An eerie dread settled over the camp, a chilly terror that reached deep into the souls of the tribal members and chilled them more than any winter breeze. The shaman's holy ceremonies resounded through the waning forests throughout day and night. They sacrificed food and drink in the hopes of appeasing the spirits, but the food and drink went to waste. The plague persisted in becoming worse, and its relentless march was a cruel, quiet reminder of how helpless they were. Initially filled with optimism, the tribe's reverence of Alistaster swiftly turned into distrust and then into outright animosity. Now everyone saw his early crush-field triumph as a cruel ploy, a lull before the never-ending darkness. He had been brought into their planet just before the great disease began. He was the Skyman, the Outlander, and a variable. What started as hushed conversations between Kale and his small group of doubters soon became into a cacophony of accusations that reverberated around the hearth. A number of new terrified individuals joined the elders group after seeing the horrifying link between Alistar's entrance and the deterioration of the forest. No god, they said. Rather, he was a cosmic parasite whose presence offended the genuine spirits of Earth and tainted their homeland with his otherworldly essence. As tensions rose and unsaid animosity crackled through the campground, the air became heavy with it. Rather than wonder, the stares that trailed after Alistar were a toxic stew of dread and loathing. His once divine reputation had faded, exposing the weak, terrified man beneath. He found himself alone and on the verge of becoming a pariah. For the most part, he was unable to leave his house. Standing watch as if he were a prisoner, the previously honorable Cathar warriors now hunched over with glum expressions and their spears at the ready. When the gunfire started, Nikita was trapped in the middle. Her allegiances were at odds within her heart. He had his most ardent advocate in the public eye in her. Only Alistar and the tribesmen's growing fear could stop her from using her savage authority and warrior's reputation. Standing before the council, her voice resonating with conviction, she would bring up the crush miracle and argue that the blight was a challenge from the spirits meant to test their faith. She would say that their new deity would help them conquer this test. In spite of the growing body of evidence and public opinion, her unfaltering devotion to Alistar allowed her to fiercely reject Kale's charges. In the stillness of the night, though her resolve wavered like a candle in the face of mounting uncertainty, she witnessed her people's anguish, the terror on the faces of the kids, and the hopelessness felt by the hunters as they returned home empty-handed. As she stood back, she could see Alistar's anxious gait, his expression betraying a vulnerability that began to erode her faith. Had I been deceived? Was Kale correct, though? Had she deceived her people into worshipping a false god who foretold their death rather than their life? Her loyalty was at odds with her responsibility to her tribe, and the conflict ripped at her, leaving her emotionally and physically bruised. When the blight killed someone from inside the tribe for the first time that night, tensions began to boil over. Despite the shaman's warnings, a little kid who had eaten tainted riverfish became violently sick and died from a fever that neither pus nor prayer could alleviate. An overwhelming sense of loss and fear swept across the camp as long-simmering animosity towards Alistar finally burst forth into full-blown fury. Outside of Kale's home, a horde had gathered, spearheaded by one of his most fervent disciples. Their lights creating tumultuous, furious silhouettes. They united in demanding his expulsion or his life. In order to physically separate them from the entryway, Nikita had to stand between them. The sole thing stopping a massacre was her authority, and she had her spear at the ready. Despite her best efforts to disperse the gathering with assurances of a resolution and threats, she was deeply disturbed by the incident. Her people's faith had vanished, and they were gripped by an overwhelming and aggressive terror. She visited Alistar later that night when she could no longer take her uncertainty. She went into his house not as a respectful maid, but as a leader whose hold on power was slipping away. The tears that were tracing their ways through her white fur were lit by the light of the candle. Her verdant eyes, which were once gleaming with determination, now glowed with sorrow and misery. Not out of reverence, but in desperation, she knelt before him. She pleaded with him, her voice quivering. The sacred vocabulary of worship vanished. You should take action if you claim to be who you say you are. The woodland expires. Everyone here is terrified. The loss of a child has occurred. Every miracle has come to an end. You were guarded by me. My trust in you has not been sufficient to rescue us, though. You must act like a god right now. Please, I beg of you. Help us out. Her unadulterated anguish was more devastating than any physical damage. As Alistar seen the haughty, ferocious warrior humbled by the desperation he had unwittingly sown, he realized the deception had come to an end. It began as a means of subsistence, but has now transformed into a hideous monster, endangering not just the individuals he had grown to admire, but also the lady he had developed feelings for to an extent he was ashamed to admit. No longer was the pretense only an inconvenience. This was wrong. Carefully, he lifted her to her feet. Now his touch is more like a man's basic consolation than the blessing of a god. He said softly but with a burdened tone, revealing a reality he could no longer deny, Nikita. I am not a deity, thus I cannot save you in that capacity. The confession came out in a torrent of shame and remorse as he inhaled deeply. Greetings, I am Alistair. I hail from a different planet as a man and a scientist. A celestial craft that belonged to me plummeted into your woodland. Only I managed to stay alive. You all knelt down and I was terrified. As a result, you compared me to a deity. His beard was yanked by him. I let you believe that because I was scared you would murder me. I was a coward. None of the ingredients, compost, fire, and water, were magical. Tech was the culprit. Tricks that are simple. Refusing to look away from her startled, unwavering stare, he halted. Also, I don't believe the blight is a curse from on high. Probably just me. It belongs to me. The accident destroyed the core that powered it. I think it's releasing some kind of toxin into your environment. An unseen but lethal force. Your forest is being decimated from the ground up. Nikita, I am not the one who will save you. I am the one who brought you such misery. On Nikita's face, a tempest of feelings surged. As soon as the astonishment wore off, a burst of raging wrath filled her. The betrayal was seen in her fiery eyes. Because of the enormity of his deceit, her whole body tensed up, and her hand sprang to the hilt of her knife. To her, he had lied. She, her religion, and her whole tribe were all embarrassed by him. Her defenses of him, including her moments of adoration and prayers, were based on complete and utter untruth. However, as his parting remarks became more apparent, a chilling and terrible sensation washed over the anger. A lethal dose, poisoning the skies with a tangible bodily substance. The withering forest was a truth that could not be denied, even though the notion was foreign. This new and terrible fact was immediately absorbed by her astute practical intellect, the mind of a hunter and a leader. There were no vengeful ghosts responsible for the blight. They may have been able to comprehend their adversary, a foe who has a point of origin. A sense of personal betrayal was overshadowed by the enormity of the danger to her planet. With a sudden shift from wrath to concentrated terror, her grip on the knife loosened. At that same moment, their entire dynamic was both changed and broken. He had ceased to be a deity deserving of adoration or a con artist deserving of contempt. He was a man, and he knew the awful truth about their impending death. He could have been the only one with the wisdom to prevent it. After Alistair's confession, the house fell into a thick, stifling stillness that was even more oppressive than the forest's natural tranquility. With the flood of her emotions receding into a condition of icy, stark clarity, Nikita remained still. Instead of a deity or a demon, the guy standing before her was something far more sinister, the bearer of a horrible truth that would destroy her whole universe. Her sharp intellect developed through years of hunting and directing. Armies swiftly assimilated the fresh data, removing the veneer of trust and treachery to expose the issue at its heart. An intangible foe that could not be vanquished with spears or prayers, a poison was seeping from his sky-hip. A wound in an incomprehensible machine was causing her people to perish. Up until just a few moments ago, the guy she had the utmost respect for was the only living thing on Earth who could comprehend the severity of that injury. The road ahead of her was frighteningly obvious. She had to be honest about this, and she couldn't let the tribe members' fears drive them to murder the one person who could save them. Making a choice that would change her and the Cathar's fates for all time, she stared into Alistair's human eyes and saw true shame and terror. She planned to present him before the council not as a deity to be adored or a liar to be slandered, but as an educator, their one possibility. She escorted him out of the house and into the unfriendly tent's encampment. As the Cathars watched, their expressions changed from devotion to a harsh, immovable purpose. Their features betrayed a mix of bewilderment and distrust as they watched their former deity being taken by his chief defender. She called a meeting of the elder council in the Grand Lodge, where the flickering shadows created by the center fire gave the elders' glum expressions the appearance of carved masks. As if feeling a change in the power currents, Kale was present, with his dubious stare more acute than before. As they gathered, Nikita took a position in front of them, with Alcestis standing astride behind her, a calculated move that hinted at a shift in their dynamic. She broke the silence with a steady, clear voice that pierced through the animosity and terror in the room. She made no compromises. She spilled the beans to them. The Sky Man, she informed them, was actually a human called Alcestis, and not a divinity. She spoke into detail about his accident, his terror, and the deception that stemmed from it. The deceit was so convincing that she couldn't help but believe it. Nikita quelled the rumble of furious, betrayed whispers that rocked the lodge with a raised fist and an icy stare that could halt a charging beast. She reframed his lie as the dire need for survival of a scared, lonely guy, and then she turned her attention to the more pressing matter at hand, painting his confession as an act of tremendous bravery rather than a confession of guilt. Then, with Alistair's assistance, she described the blight in its actuality. He took the stage and explained radiation using examples that he and Nikita had come up with in a flash. His ship's damaged heart was leaking its toxic heat onto the land and sea, and he spoke of an invisible inferno that burned within. The way he described the poison's gradual effects on plant and animal vitality, a weakening of their life force that made them unwell from the inside out, rang eerily true to what the tribe was seeing. Without using a divinely inspired word, he proceeded to lay out his strategy. Assumed persona, brimming solely with the unfiltered candor of a scientist confronted with a disastrous dilemma. Telling them he had to go back to the Wanderer's wreckage to get to the reactor core was his story. A final tremendous surge of energy would devour all the remaining fuel simultaneously, cauterizing the wound and ending the sluggish constant leak. He could only do this by initiating a controlled, extremely violent overload. He made it plain that the operation was extremely risky, that the energy surge may be fatal, that the likelihood of its complete failure was high. He didn't promise redemption. All he gave was a tenuous scientific blueprint that was both dangerous and full of hope. Absolute anarchy ensued at the resort. The soldiers loyal to Kale sprang to their feet in a flurry. Their voices raised in a furious uproar, demanding Alistar's life for his lies and for the poison he had brought to their world. They saw his plan not as a solution, but as a final, destructive trick. Just as the warriors were about to seize Alcestis, Kale rose from his seat, his ancient face grim, and with a single sharp command he silenced the lodge. All eyes turned to the elder, the long-time voice of skepticism, expecting him to deliver the final condemnation. Instead, he stared at Alcestis, his eyes holding not anger, but a dawning, horrified recognition. He began to speak, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth. He spoke not of the present, but of the distant past, of the oldest oral histories of the Cathar. The legends he had accused Alcestis of not knowing. He recounted the tale of the time of withering which occurred generations ago, so long past that it was considered mere myth by many. The story told of a poisonous star that fell from the sky and of a creeping blight that followed a sickness that mirrored their current plight in every terrible detail. The ancestors, Kale explained, had faced extinction. The shaman's prayers went unanswered, and the forest died around them. The legend said they were saved not by the spirits they prayed to, but by their own forgotten knowledge. They turned to the great totems not as objects of worship, but as tools. The legend was vague on the details, speaking only of how the ancestors sang the stone and wood into a shield against the star's poison. Alistair listened, stunned. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know he was solving clicking into place. The totems, the bearded god. It wasn't a prophecy of his arrival. It was a historical record of a previous similar event. The figure on the totem wasn't a god. It was likely another survivor of another crash, another being with a beard who had faced a similar crisis. He turned to Cale, his mind racing. The totems, he said, his voice urgent. "Can I see the oldest one, the one at the heart of the encampment?" A new strange understanding passed between the old skeptic and the young scientist. Cale nodded slowly and led the way, the rest of the council following. Their anger forgotten, replaced by a confused awe. They came to the central totem, a massive pillar of dark wood that seemed to absorb the firelight. It was ancient, its carvings weathered and smooth. Alistair pulled out his multi-tool, its scanner humming to life. He ran it along the surface of the wood, and the device chirped its screen, displaying a complex energy signature. The wood itself possessed unique bioresonant properties, capable of dampening and absorbing certain frequencies of radiation. More astonishingly, the scanner revealed a fine metallic lattice woven deep within the wood, an intricate network that spiraled up the entire length of the totem. It was technology ancient and elegant, a perfect fusion of biology and engineering. The Cathar's ancestors hadn't just been hunters. They had been masters of a science their descendants had forgotten, preserving the knowledge only through the vague language of myth. This discovery changed everything. Cale stared at the readings on Alistair's data slate, his lifetime of skepticism giving way to a profound understanding. The songs of the ancestors weren't prayers. They were likely sonic frequencies used to activate the resonant properties of the totems. Their earth knowledge and Alistair's sky knowledge were not in conflict. They were two halves of a single solution. A new unspoken alliance was forged in that moment, an understanding that transcended their different worlds. They returned to the lodge, and a new plan was born, a synthesis of ancient legend and modern science. Alistair would still go to the reactor to initiate the overload, but he would not go alone, and the tribe would not simply be hiding and praying for his success. While he was at the crash site, Cale and the remaining shamans would attempt to reactivate the network of totems using Alistair's technology to help them find the correct sonic frequencies to create the energy shield their ancestors had spoken of, a containment field to protect the forest and the encampment from the violent pulse of the dying reactor. The risk was still immense, but for the first time there was a sense of shared purpose, of agency. They were no longer victims of the blight, but active participants in their own salvation. The final days before the mission were a blur of intense activity. Alistair worked tirelessly with Cale, teaching the elder the basics of his technology, while Cale instructed Alistair on the properties of the forest. Nikita became the essential bridge between them, translating not just their words, but their concepts, ensuring the scientist and the shaman understood one another. Her relationship with Alistair was reforged in the crucible of this shared purpose. The last vestiges of her divine worship were burned away, replaced by a deep and abiding respect for his intelligence and his courage. They were partners now in the truest sense of the word, bound not by faith or romance, but by the imminent threat of extinction and the shared will to defy it. As they stood at the edge of the encampment, ready to depart for the poisoned ground of the crash site, they shared a look not of fear, but of resolute determination. The fate of the Cathar rested on their shoulders, on an alliance between a man of science, a warrior leader, and the forgotten legacy of a fallen star. The journey to the crash site was a grim pilgrimage through a dying world, a landscape that grew more alien and hostile with every step.